It's not often when doing a death of a game video that it's associated with a game or company that recently has seen its demise. Visceral Games, only a month ago, was shut down by its parent company, Electronic Arts. For some people, it's another opportunity to elicit more votes for EA as the US's worst company. For the more inquisitive types, you might be wondering why the studio behind titles like Dead Space, Godfather 2, and Lord of the Rings: The Third Age failed. Well, there's only one place to start on this journey, the beginning of it all. In 1998, Electronic Arts moved from their San Mateo headquarters in California to a new building constructed in Redwood Shores. At the same time, they founded a new studio and named it something which demonstrated Electronic Arts' legendary creativity: EA Redwood Shores. Their first game would be an action-based game titled Future Cop LAPD, which was a fairly generic action game, but did relatively well considering. The period of 2002 and 2008 saw Redwood making primarily non-original IP games, such as golf games like Tiger Woods' PGA Tour, NASCAR games, and 007 games. Likely their most notable games of this time are Lord of the Rings: The Third Age, an RPG that did rather average if it were a normal game, but since it donned the Lord of the Rings name, it likely had that much more of a boost. I remember playing the game as a kid and found it interesting since it was essentially Final Fantasy Lord of the Rings style. Still, despite the Lord of the Rings name, it barely scored a 74 on Metacritic. This trend of lukewarm titles continued with their future titles such as Godfather and The Simpsons game. But then things got really interesting. Despite EA's stance on Redwood not making a unique title, much of the core team at Redwood wanted to do a System Shock 3. It wasn't just the Redwood office wanting to do the title. Glenn Schofield, a GM at EA, also pushed executives to do the game as well. During this time, in 2005, Capcom had just released their popular thriller Reborn, Resident Evil 4. This sort of made EA Redwood pivot their idea of a System Shock 3 to an original IP later known as Dead Space.
Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky, when the blazing sun is gone, when the nothing shines upon.
Dead Space was launched in 2008 and was met with critical acclaim. Metacritic had it scored at just under 90 out of 100, quite a feat for a company who had traditionally made B or even C+ games. Dead Space was a survival horror sci-fi game where you played as Isaac, an engineer stranded on a necromorph-infested mining ship. Much like Resident Evil 4, critics lauded its action combat that was just slow enough to keep you scared of attacking foes, but not slow enough to be able to kill some reanimated corpses. The graphics were also great for the time, which with the help of a soundtrack made for a disturbingly deep atmosphere. Likely due to Dead Space's success, EA Redwood rebranded to Visceral Games in 2009. Visceral Games was a third-person action game studio, the first genre studio of the company at the time. Staying a subsidiary of EA, Visceral Games' studio in Redwood would also be accompanied by two more sister studios, one in Montreal and one in Melbourne, Australia. As 2009 came to a close, Visceral's main studio was working on Dante's Inferno, inspired by a dark and religiously themed text, The Divine Comedy, which includes vivid descriptions of Inferno, or Hell. At the same time, Visceral's Melbourne studio had been working on a title dubbed The Ripper, where you would play as an infamous serial killer, Jack the Ripper, but there was an interesting twist in the sense that you would be hunting vampires or something of the sort. Sadly, that game never came to fruition. The Melbourne studio did attempt to pivot to a multiplayer game based on the same engine. That game would be rumored to be titled Blood Dust. There's a bit of the gameplay on screen, complete with some truly terrible music, but there was really nothing else that came of that game. The Melbourne studio would later die out, failing to release both aforementioned titles. Returning to the Dante's Infernal title, it was an interesting game. Not the game itself particularly, but the whole hilarity and drama that the game and its marketing had created. Dante Inferno had an iconic ad play at the Super Bowl in 2009, playing the famous Bill Withers song, Ain't No Sunshine, while watching the protagonist leap into hell to chase his falling heroine. Hilariously, Visceral also sent a couple of packages to gaming outlets such as PlayStation and The Escapist. These packages were spooky looking boxes that, when opened, played Rick Astley. Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you... The song's actually not that bad once you get into it. The only way to stop these boxes from playing the troll music was to break the box open, where it had a note inside that read, "You had succumbed to wrath, one of the deadly sins," which fit the theme of their Dante's Inferno game. Pretty creative and equally hilarious. There were tons of examples of their funny marketing, for example a website and ad for a Mass We Pray game, where pressing the order the game would deem you a heretic and play the Dante's Inferno ad. Unfortunately, the website doesn't exist anymore, so I can't show you guys what it entailed, but it sounds absolutely hilarious. All of these funny bits of marketing seem far too creative for the likes of EA. Maybe Visceral Games was only EA in name. Before Dante's Inferno launched, it had its share of controversy too. A group of religious protesters sat outside the Los Angeles Convention Center protesting that hell was not a game. They even went as far to call EA the Antichrist. That's shockingly relevant to today's recent events.
Fucking loot crates.
Well, it looks like EA is doing everything they
I tried to warn you. This is the only way to progress in the game.
Really pissed off.
Looks like you fucked up, didn't you?
All of the good fun aside though, let's focus on the actual game and its response. Well, there wasn't much of one. Scoring around a 75 on Metacritic, Dante's Inferno was sort of a return to old form for Visceral Games, and not in a good way. Another lukewarm response, with some reviewers going as far to call it a God of War clone. All in all, the game had arguably one of the most entertaining marketing campaigns, and along the way stirred up an awful lot of controversy. Even the INA, which I never heard of it until I made this video, the International Nanny Association, was up in arms. But when it came to the actual merit of the game, it wasn't very impressive. So Visceral Games returned to what they had done most successfully, Dead Space in the form of a sequel.
You're in terrible, terrible danger.
Much like their first title, they had yet again reached critical acclaim. Scoring an aggregate score of 89 on Metacritic, Dead Space 2 managed to keep the same level of horror present in the first game, while vastly improving the combat and cinematic feel of the title. Fans and reviewers also praised the idea of making Isaac Clarke a speaking protagonist, versus the previously silent one. Dead Space 2 doubled the previous game's success, selling as many as 4 million copies, which nearly guaranteed that there would be another sequel. And another sequel there was. Dead Space 3 launched 2 years later. But this time, something was different. The core of the game had been changed to more of an action-based game. It also incorporated some sort of forced multiplayer co-op, something that truly felt out of place in the game. Co-op titles don't really lend themselves towards a horror feel, since you're kind of in comms with people and they're laughing and giggling about things, and it really diffuses a lot of the tension. While Dead Space 2 had co-op later introduced in the form of a DLC pack, Dead Space 3 had such at launch, and to make matters worse, the co-op game mode had cutscenes where your integral buddy, quote-unquote, would just flat out disappear. Not to mention, at this point EA had started to adapt microtransactions into their titles, and such was present in Dead Space 3. Stitched together like a necromorph and proving just as deadly to the reception of the game. Dead Space 3 scored a 78 on Metacritic, and anything short of fantastic was considered a colossal failure for such a successful franchise, especially when both previous titles had sold more and performed better critically. When Disney acquired Lucasfilms, they shut down their LucasArts game development studio. EA, sensing opportunity like a shark sensing blood, made a deal quickly to develop a Star Wars game through 3 of its different studios, one of those studios including Visceral Games. The other one would be, of course, DICE, making the Battlefront series. Visceral Games opted to pitch a third-person action game. This would have players in the role of some sort of space scoundrels. The game would be open world and based in the Star Wars universe. This project early on was codenamed Yuma. Joining the Visceral team would be none other than Amy Hennig, the writer responsible for the first 3 Uncharted games created by Naughty Dog. Amy would serve as Visceral Games' creative lead and hopefully propel their budding Star Wars project to the next level. Right around the same time, Visceral Games was pouring the majority of their focus on Battlefield Hardline. This complicated their Project Yuma, which in turn complicated Battlefield Hardline that much more. Despite having nearly nothing in common, the projects were closely linked. Let's focus on Hardline first. Battlefield Hardline was targeted at a launch nearing the end of 2014. That initial date was delayed and the game was launched in March 2015. What made Battlefield Hardline unique was its breakaway from traditional Battlefield games that were, well, typically fought on battlefields. Hardline was a war on crime. It was about bad guys versus good guys. Maps were noticeably smaller and it attempted to have a focus on a single-player story mode that played much like a cop drama. Some critics enjoyed the break from formula, others wondered why they would even call such a Battlefield game, period. Battlefield Hardline had an aggregate score of 73 on Metacritic, failing to really impress the audience and critics alike. The largest gripes from people were the over-reliance on stealth aspects, while fun didn't really fit the style of a Battlefield game, and it didn't really lend itself to learning the multiplayer. Typically, a single-player experience kind of prepares you for how a multiplayer experience is supposed to be, and since stealth aspects were such a critical part, that doesn't really set you up for online. Others disliked the bland characters and the plot, how the game felt like a 20-hour-long cinematic versus being an actual game. While the multiplayer modes were unique, that wasn't really enough to keep people in for the long haul.
Fuck that.
Despite people reporting Battlefield Hardline a failure, EA seemed to think that the game didn't really sell poorly. I'm not really sure what to take from that, so take that as you will, as EA has proven that selling 1 million or even 2 million copies can sometimes still not even make a profit. So maybe they were just trying to save face, but who knows. After Hardline shipped, EA started to let go of some of the key personnel at Visceral, most notably Steve Pap Outsis. I feel like you could make a compilation of me mispronouncing names. Steve was one of the lead talking heads behind Battlefield Hardline. You probably remember his mug. Instead, EA placed Scott Probst as GM, son of Larry Probst, a board member at EA. Someone go ahead and make that compilation. Wana and Bagwell, 2 of the devs behind Dead Space, left to form their own studio, Outpost Games. The changes didn't stop there though. EA also changed the structure of Visceral, making it more like Naughty Dog's structure, which lacked producers and had a large focus on creativity. The company was then split in 2 as one team, dubbed the Chosen Team by ex-employees, worked on the newly dubbed Ragtag project, which was Yuma under a different codename, and the other half worked on Battlefield Hardline, or at least the Battlefield Hardline DLC. Ouch. The Star Wars project had undergone a name change because it, well, had also undergone a idea change. Amy shifted the title from being an open-world Star Wars game to a more linear narrative, much like Uncharted. To assist the tiny Visceral Games team working on Ragtag, EA established another studio in Montreal titled Motive Studios. This was led by Jade Raymond, the original producer for Assassin's Creed. They would be working on Ragtag alongside Visceral Games, which added an additional 70 people to the team. But despite the seemingly new investment into Ragtag, there was an awful lot of turmoil between Visceral and EA over the direction of the game, as well as the focus on a non-Jedi-like character. Hennig didn't seem to mind Ragtag not having a Jedi character, as the game focused more on a crew and the ability to switch between characters while carrying out some sort of heist. This, Hennig and team felt, would distinguish them from Uncharted while also offering an incredibly ambitious and unique way to play a Star Wars title. In the article on screen, an ex-employee gushes about the idea, stating that Hennig had people totally bought in on the idea. As 2015 came, EA, through another subsidiary, DICE, launched Star Wars Battlefront to much commercial success. But fans of the game weren't so happy with how gutted the game was at launch in comparison to the previous Battlefronts. But by 2016, the game was selling well over 10 million copies, so in EA's eyes, it was a success. Fans wanted a single-player component, which was totally missing in the game, something perhaps Ragtag could have solved. Battlefront's success, however, dealt an indirect blow to Visceral Games, and by association, Project Ragtag. EA took Motive Studios off of Ragtag and focused them on the single-player campaign for the upcoming Battlefront sequel. EA also halted any new hiring for Visceral Studios, essentially crippling Ragtag. Despite layoffs in early 2016 plaguing Visceral's staff and development stalling, Visceral continued to push on and revealed a bit of gameplay at E3 2016. This bought them a bit more time, as EA opted to insert EA Vancouver's team to help with the development on Ragtag. What seemed like a positive thing, though, quickly became negative. The two studios clashed culturally, and to some it seemed like EA was positioning EA Vancouver to take over Project Ragtag. April 2017 came along and Visceral Games & Co. presented an internal demo to EA, which granted them a bit more time. But not much though. Visceral managed to get a working demo in place upon showing it to EA in mid-October 2017. This led to the shutdown of Visceral Games just days later. EA cited a disagreement in the nature of the game, wanting it to be refocused. Patrick Soderlund, the EA vice president, said of the game's refocus, to be a broader experience that allows for more variety and player agency, leaning into the capabilities of our Frostbite engine and reimagining central elements of the game to give players a Star Wars adventure of greater depth and breadth to explore. Likely with some sort of games-as-a-service feel to it. Oh, dread. No details about where Amy Hennig is to end up, and as of now, Project Ragtag is in the hands of EA Vancouver. And thus, Visceral Games ceases to exist, and the future of Ragtag, well, at least the original idea of it, uncertain. EA no doubt will find some way to bastardize the game, making it some sort of games-as-a-service title. So what went wrong with Visceral Games? Why did they face their ultimate demise? Before I get into that, I think it's important we first remember the studio for the positive stuff. What kind of legacy did Visceral Games leave for the video game world? When Visceral Games created the Dead Space franchise, they created a survival horror game that they believed could rival that of Resident Evil. It was ambitious of them, but they wanted to create their own Resident Evil in a way. Dead Space was a return to sci-fi, taking more of an alien approach, more so than a zombie one like present in Resident Evil. This was refreshing to some. Isaac was also even facing things like dementia. Very rarely did things such as mental health be addressed in video games, period. Dead Space wasn't afraid in their first two titles of addressing such. Though I particularly don't enjoy horror games due to the inherent linear nature of them, I bought and played the first Dead Space, and the boss fights were certainly all of frightening. Because I don't think that horror is done particularly well, I think we should tip our hats to Visceral Games on what they were able to accomplish with the Dead Space franchise. At the beginning of the video, I explained how Visceral Games and even the previous entity, EA Redwood, was sort of this average game developer. They never quite cracked an 80 rating on anything, scoring what most would consider a C-like rating. But Visceral Games didn't give up. They consistently kept putting out content. In fact, they were ambitious in wanting an original IP, something that EA wasn't really allowing them to do. Their first original IP was Dead Space, of course, and it was a smashing success. I have to say it takes some level of confidence despite rather average results to want to push ahead and not settle for just doing what is safe. Actively seeking an ambitious title such as System Shock, and when that fell through, wanting to make your own System Shock / Resident Evil in a way. It's admirable to say the least. There's only rumors of what Project Ragtag could have been, at least in its original implementation back in the Yuma days. Since it had undergone numerous changes, it's kinda hard to see where it would end up now, and how much of it was based on the original vision. But the original vision of Amy Hennig was quite tantalizing to say the least. The idea of being able to switch through the different crew members while doing heists as a scoundrel in the Star Wars universe? Excuse me as I drooled just slightly. That sounds incredible. Finally a Star Wars game that's not about the Jedi and not about the Sith, just about some scoundrels trying to find their way in the world. That's why Han Solo was such a popular character. He was just the average Joe, just sort of thrown into everything and trying to make ends meet, who also ended up getting the girl. But since the Project Ragtag of old never came to be and likely won't in the same way that it was supposed to be initially at least, we can only hope and dream that such a thing comes true eventually, or mourn the loss of such an idea. Side note, the marketing behind Dante's Inferno deserves a mention too. Really great marketing and quite frankly one of a kind, something I think that's really unmatched to this day. Visceral Games' legacy will hopefully live on in some capacity, Who knows, maybe Project Ragtag in the future will still have some of the initial ideas of the game. And it's certainly important we remember Visceral Games for what they did best. However, as the sadists you all are, everyone wants to talk about now how Visceral Games failed. And why. Why did Visceral Games die? Dead Space was both Visceral Games' greatest success and, well, sort of one of their biggest shortcomings too. It's fitting we choose to start here when discussing the largest reasons for Visceral Games' failure. Although both Dead Space 1 and 2 sold remarkably well and had very high ratings, according to Zach Wilson, a previous designer at Visceral Games, Dead Space 2 cost $60 million to make/market. Selling 4 million copies was impressive for a title, but when you put so much money into a game to be successful, you kind of need a blockbuster level of success to do such. Even though Dead Space 1 and 2 by all accounts are critically acclaimed, EA still saw them as sort of failures. That's likely why with Dead Space 3, they sort of forced some sort of co-op into the game, thinking that maybe it could make the game a bit more generally appealing. And that's sort of the issue with this. Dead Space was not designed to be some sort of massive blockbuster hit. Horror games inherently don't allow for that. They set a number of the audience off right away due to the sheer scare factor. Horror games can be successful in their own right. I mean, look at horror movies for God's sakes. They're extremely profitable. But that wasn't good enough for EA. They wanted, for comparison, the Avatar level of movie success. The president of EA Labels, Frank Cabot, said, "Ultimately, you need to get an audience sizes of around 5 million to continue to invest in an IP like Dead Space. Anything less, and it's difficult financially given how expensive it is to make games and market them." To make matters worse, when EA injected microtransactions into Dead Space 3, it was more proof that they were trying to pinch as much money from the customer as possible, likely in response to them believing the past two games were failures. Ben Wannett stated that the crafting system was never built to be a microtransaction system, but thus the dangers of a publisher and, in the case of Visceral, their parent company. This is bizarre from EA. You had this very successful franchise gutted and forced to change its focus. This was all but confirmed by devs. In an article on Eurogamer conducted by Chris Bratt with Ben Wannett, the dev behind Dead Space 3, Ben outlined how the co-op was sort of forced into Dead Space 3, and since they had little time and money to pull it off, it came off as, well, not very good. Ben clearly was apprehensive in talking about microtransactions when prompted, stating that it was a delicate subject with EA and that the business side of things were stressing that it can make more money for the title. But you can tell with Ben, as a previous creative director for Dead Space, was sort of solemn in a way. They had their vision of what they wanted Dead Space to move towards. They wanted it to highlight Isaac's ongoing and increasing levels of dementia, but EA suits didn't think it was a subject that they should broach, once again showing that they didn't understand why the franchise was successful in the first place. A horror game is inherently niche. Trying to reach a broader audience with a title like Dead Space is just risking losing the good thing that you had in the first place. When you try to force changes into a game not really meant to be generally acceptable, you take away from the very soul of the game. I figured I would at least mention Battlefield Hardline and its failure briefly, before ending with my most critical point of the video. Let's face it, Battlefield Hardline was a game that certainly attempted to be different from other Battlefields, but it was sort of a moot point. It almost piggybacks off of the previous point I just made. It was like making League of Legends a mystery game. Sure, some could like the changes and even prefer them, but the vast majority are going to want to play League for the original reason they wanted to play it in the first place, to get to play a MOBA. Perhaps if the story in Hardline didn't fall so flat, and maybe their travel outside the lines of once typically expected in a Battlefield game could have been more successful. But then again, many would probably say it's more so that the multiplayer that defines a Battlefield game than the single player. If you look at Battlefield 2142, a fan favorite in the genre, it certainly was different than a traditional war game. It was futuristic with flying vehicles and laser guns, but it worked because it got the core concept of Battlefield right, the big massive scale, with just enough small maps to make players feel like they weren't just a pawn. And once again you see the same repeat issue, trying to take a game, force it to be different, and then really alienating a lot of the original fanbase. Battlefield Hardline went through that same thing that Dead Space went through, just in a little bit of a different way. But now that we've tied up our loose ends, let's move on to the likely largest reason for Visceral Games' failure. Project Ragtag, the mysterious Star Wars title that was to be developed by Visceral Games, was in many ways to be Visceral's saving grace. An awful lot was riding on the success of the game. But was the game ever really set up properly for success in the first place? Why did Project Ragtag have so many issues? Prepare yourselves. This next one's a doozy. Initially, Amy Hennig and team pitched Ragtag as a third-person action game where players played as space scoundrels in an open-world style Star Wars universe. But after Battlefield Hardline had issues with its development, including its engine, this meant that the company had to focus on Hardline, and resources were taken away from Ragtag. As the article on Kotaku said, a fantastic article by the way, that has given me immense data, sources within Visceral stated that they didn't want to work on Hardline. This meant part of the original team set in place was moved around. Some even left the company. By the time Hardline was released, Amy Hennig seemed to want to return to her comfort zone, creating another Uncharted just in the Star Wars universe. This meant making Ragtag more of a linear story-based game, much like Uncharted. This pivot likely could have been her realizing she would have less resources than previously assumed, or her just going with what she saw as her bread and butter. Hennig also made a subtle change to the story in Ragtag. It was going to be more about performing a grand heist of sorts, a story of criminal mischief, not much unlike Ocean's 11. But Amy made strides to make the game different than a typical Uncharted game, or at least tried to. This came with this adjusted companion system that allowed you to switch between characters mid-heist. Certainly ambitious, especially for a project that already started so rocky. Already as late as 2014, they barely had any actual development done. When things seemed like they were on the up and up, EA once again split the dev team to work on the Hardline DLC. At this point, Visceral as a whole had 100 employees. After the split, easily half that. Compare this to Uncharted 4, which had 200 plus, and it's not even comparable. As issues were solved, or potentially to be solved, more issues were created. EA demanded a multiplayer component, and thus the team had to devote resources to such. To make matters worse, EA was going to force Visceral, just like they did their other companies, to use their Frostbite engine. This is sort of like how Mass Effect used the Unreal Engine, despite it being designed to primarily be an RPG. This creates issues, obviously, as many of us who played Mass Effect 1 are familiar with. The same issues were likely occurring in the development with Ragtag, as it was a third-person action-adventure story-based title, that's a mouthful, using a shooter engine, the Frostbite engine. Though as Amy and the team discovered of their ambitious project, it was going to take immense time and resources to come up with not just one character, the main character, but multiple characters, fully voiced and fully playable companion characters. What started as a cornerstone of their most recent idea, the thing that was supposed to set them apart from Uncharted, was now nothing more than a pipe dream. And this is where the age-old story of business versus creativity begins yet again. As creatives clung to their ambitious goals, lofty ones at that, the business suits at EA started to poke holes in their creative armor, if you will. Why didn't a game about Star Wars have the Force in it, asked EA. What about Wookiees? Every scoundrel needs a Wookiee counterpart, and what was even the game that they were trying to make? EA, as explained in the Kotaku article by previous members of the Visceral Games staff, expected with the help of Amy for their new Star Wars title to compete with Uncharted 4. Talk about a lofty goal. They didn't even have a solid foundation, and they already had expectations from suits that they had to score better than a 90 on Metacritic and go up against one of the best gaming franchises of all time. This created a pressure cooker-like situation, and not really in a good way. Amy was fresh off Uncharted 3 and halfway through the development of Uncharted 4. She had this relatively new team, a team that possibly hadn't created anything close to a legendary title like she had, and then she was told by EA to create a masterpiece with them. It's no wonder she took control of nearly all creative aspects in the game, including aspects she probably wasn't very suited in. And this was an issue ex-employee stated. Sure, she was a fantastic writer and creator, but she had no business designing a world or level, at least according to some of the ex-employees. Since the GM at Visceral Games attempted to create a similar structure to Naughty Dog, the now newly autonomous development team was put in a position where they were expected to answer to Hennig when creating things and largely focus on their own otherwise. They kind of were like chickens with their head cut off. freedom is great and all, but if you don't know what to do with that freedom and you don't have the level of dedication, at least self-dedication, to be able to stick to something and be consistent with it, then you kind of just run around and not really know what you're doing. Kind of reminiscent of the APB story. Things didn't get better after Battlefront launched in 2015. This meant that the team working on Ragtag was yet again split. At this point, they had reportedly 30 or so employees working on the game, with 40 more to join once they shipped the Battlefield Hardlines DLC. Still nothing near close to what they needed, especially with how far behind schedule they were. So as 2016 crept on, Ragtag had issues that were still stewing since the very beginning. Losing more employees, the Frostbite engine still giving them issues, EA continually losing trust and questioning Visceral, and Amy, a leader put in a position where she felt she had to meticulously critique everything she was given. Surely you have to put some of the blame on Amy. In the article on Kotaku, it was reported at least 3 former employees that were interviewed left due to Hennick's frustrating direction. One of the former employees said of Amy, "Amy's phenomenally smart, fiercely smart, talented, incredibly good at cutscenes, but she was balanced by other talented individuals at Naughty Dog. This was a team she hadn't worked with before." When speaking of Visceral, "I felt like she didn't really trust us." Amy did feel a bit out of her element. Here she was in a corporate environment like EA where dollar is the most important thing, and she had to pitch these ideas primarily from a single player perspective, which was not really something particularly interesting to EA, especially after their success of adopting the newly minted games as a service industry. Or if you look at their FIFA franchise and how much money they're able to make off of their FIFA team. Not to mention, as a single player developer, you're talking about, oh, maybe we can sell a couple million copies, maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 million copies. Meanwhile, sports games under the EA branch are making hundreds of millions based on their microtransactions. And this is where Visceral really meets their doom in the end. As the market evolves over the troubled development of Ragtag, companies like EA realize that you can create games without a single player campaign that focus on an online persistent format instead, one that includes microtransactions. With EA titles like FIFA and Star Wars Battlefront raking in the cash, single player games didn't really seem all that interesting anymore. They weren't really good for business. As EA put in their statement about the death of Visceral games, in its current form it was shaping up to be a story-based linear adventure game. Throughout the development process, we have been testing the game concept with players, listening to the feedback about what and how they want to play, and closely tracking the fundamental shifts in the marketplace. That's the key word. It has become clear that to deliver an experience that players will want to come back and enjoy for a long time to come, we need to pivot the design. This is fancy marketing speech for, well, essentially what I just said previously. It's not economically feasible to make such a title in the current marketplace, not as a AAA company at least. Ragtag's failure was a catastrophic one failure that frankly had gone on far too long, but it unequivocally was the reason Visceral Games died in the end, though the studio was likely slowly dying at that point anyway. As much as EA would like us to believe that their decisions were even an ounce decided by creativity, we all know it was about business in the end. Creatives and business people had been fighting for ages. It's likely we will never see any of that really resolved, and that's okay. What's not okay is if the future of gaming is only business focused, because then everything will have loot boxes, everything will have microtransactions, season passes galore, and single player games really will die, at least in the AAA format. You will need a balance of the two. Enough creativity to make things interesting and enough business to keep the business afloat. When games like Dead Space 3 and Ragtag have their identities warped into money-making machines, they lose their very foundation of what made them great, or possibly could have made them great in the case of Ragtag. Visceral's death in itself might not really seem important to some, but Visceral was another company that died when it failed to evolve, for better or for worse. We have to respect the people behind Dead Space and those on the Ragtag team for not wanting to give up, for not wanting to just bend their game to whatever amalgamation EA wanted to create. In the end though, EA as a parent company will get what they want, and that's money. Sometimes it takes the sacrifice of some to benefit the future, and with titles like Star Wars Battlefront 2 and Middle-earth Shadow of War seeming like they have finally crossed some imaginary line with the fans, maybe there still is a chance that the market can adapt in a more positive way, a way that serves us, the fans. Thanks for watching, guys.